Ariel King, 32, stood in front of her bathroom mirror, her deep brown skin glowing under the soft, morning light. With striking, almond-shaped eyes that had seen the worst and the best of humanity, she exuded a quiet confidence that came from years of having to prove herself in spaces that weren't made for people like her. Her natural hair, thick and coiled, framed her face in a halo of curls, a look that made her feel both grounded and unyielding in a world that often sought to dismiss her. Ariel was a woman of contradictions. She could navigate the tightest of boardrooms with the precision of a seasoned lawyer, yet find solace in the most humble of spaces, whether that meant tending to the small garden on her apartment balcony or indulging in long, solitary walks along the shore. She dressed in a style that blended modern elegance with effortless comfort, her clothes a reflection of a woman who had come into her own. Today, she wore a crisp white blouse tucked into a pair of tailored jeans, an outfit that balanced business and casual, because she was headed to a client meeting at the beach, a meeting that would unexpectedly turn her day upside down. In the mirror, Ariel gave herself one last glance before grabbing her bag and stepping out. The world was already moving, but it felt like she was still taking a breath to catch up. She had always felt like an outsider in many spaces, despite her successes. Yet, she was no stranger to pushing through it, using her intellect and strength to carve out a place for herself. Ariel's day always began early. She prided herself on being a morning person. Before the sun had fully risen, she would sip her coffee, staring out of her window as the city around her came to life. The early hours allowed her space to think, to be with herself before the demands of the day took over. Her routine was ritualistic in nature, a set of practices that grounded her amid the chaos of her professional life. By 7 a.m., she would be at the gym, lifting weights, a release for the stress she carried from her demanding career in real estate. Her gym sessions were an escape, a time to push her body to the limit while her mind cleared. After a quick shower, she'd head to her office, a modern, glass-walled space in downtown, an emblem of the success she had fought for. She wasn't just a broker. Ariel had built her reputation from the ground up, navigating the male-dominated industry and continually proving her worth to clients who underestimated her at first glance. But even with all the accolades, the weight of being one of the few black women in her field sometimes pressed on her. It wasn't always overt. Sometimes it was the subtle dismissal of her ideas in meetings, or the glances that followed her when she walked into a luxury property. Still, she had learned how to mask the discomfort, smiling in the face of microaggressions, keeping her composure when people questioned her credentials. But every now and then, a small part of her wondered if she would ever be fully accepted in spaces that didn't want her. The beach was a place of escape for Ariel, a refuge from the high-rise buildings, the constant rush of her career, and the never-ending expectations placed on her. She discovered this spot months ago, a small, private cove tucked away in a stretch of coastline that was off-limits to the public. It was the kind of place that most people didn't even know existed unless they had an insider's knowledge. Ariel had grown fond of it over time, enjoying the rare solitude it offered. The water was a serene shade of blue, calm and inviting, the sand soft underfoot and golden, the kind that seemed to shimmer in the sunlight. Ariel had always loved the ocean. Its vastness reminded her of the world's endless possibilities, of the freedom she craved in moments of quiet reflection. The beach was a sanctuary, and she had made it her own. Whether that meant walking along the shoreline or lounging with a book, the rhythm of the waves never failed to soothe her mind. But today, as she made her way to the water, the sound of waves crashing against the rocks was interrupted by an unfamiliar presence. A group of security guards, with stern expressions, stood at the entrance of the cove, blocking her path. The serene atmosphere suddenly felt charged, the air thick with tension. Ariel's brow furrowed as she approached, unsure of what was happening. "Sorry, ma'am. This area is for members only," one of the guards said, his tone polite but firm. Ariel's heart skipped a beat, the world around her feeling oddly out of place. She had been coming here for weeks. The deed to this property was in her name. The beach, her beach, was a sanctuary that belonged to her just as much as anyone else. But the guard didn't seem to know that. And as Ariel stood there, The beginning of something she hadn't expected began to unfold. There was a flicker of doubt in her mind, but more than that, a quiet determination. She wasn't going to be dismissed this time. Ariel had barely reached the small, sandy path that led to the secluded beach when the security guard stepped forward, blocking her way with his outstretched hand. His crisp uniform looked almost too sharp against the soft blue sky and the tranquil backdrop of the ocean. The other guards stood nearby, their eyes scanning the area as though waiting for something to happen or for her to leave. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to turn back," the guard repeated, his voice growing firmer. Ariel's brow furrowed, and she took a step closer, her pulse quickening. "Excuse me," she asked, surprised. She'd been here countless times before, her name on the deed to the property that included this stretch of beach. "This is a private area for members only," the guard stated again, more firmly this time. "You'll have to leave." Ariel blinked, unable to process what was happening. "What do you mean, members only? I have the deed to this property. I've been coming here for months. Ma'am, please," the guard cut her off. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave now. I can't let you pass." Confusion rose in Ariel's chest, quickly followed by a simmering frustration. She reached into her bag, pulling out a small document. "I own this property. I have the deed right here," she said, her voice laced with disbelief. She was about to hand it to him when another voice interrupted her. "You think you own it?" A woman, dressed in expensive beachwear, appeared beside the guards. She was tall and blonde, wearing oversized sunglasses that hid most of her face, though her piercing eyes gleamed with an unmistakable air of superiority. Her expression was cold, calculating, and judgmental. "I'm afraid this beach is private property now, and you don't belong here," the woman said, her voice dripping with entitlement. Ariel's stomach tightened. The woman's tone sent a ripple of anger through her, a sense that she was being dismissed not just as an outsider, but as someone who was beneath consideration. She hadn't even seen her before, yet this woman was treating her as though she had no right to be there. The guard stood motionless, waiting for Ariel to react. The woman, apparently a member of the private beach's exclusive club, was now standing directly in front of her, looking at her with an air of condescension that Ariel found unbearable. "I'm sorry, but I've been coming here for months, and I've never had an issue. I own this land," Ariel repeated, her voice shaky with a mixture of disbelief and growing frustration. She raised the deed once more, but the woman simply glanced at it and then looked back at Ariel with a smirk. "You own the property?" she asked, as though the words didn't hold any weight. "That may be true, but you aren't welcome here." "Not anymore." Ariel's heart pounded in her chest, a cocktail of shock, confusion, and the faintest sense of humiliation twisting within her. What was happening? How was this possible? The guard turned to the woman, his eyes narrowing, but he didn't question her. His role was clear: enforce the rules, and her word was final. Ariel stood there, stunned. Was this really happening? Was she being kicked out of a beach she legally owned, not because of a lack of ownership, but because of who she was? The first thing Ariel felt was disbelief. How could this be happening? She was a woman who had built her life on her own terms. She was accustomed to the challenges of a world that didn't always make space for her, but she had never experienced anything like this. She'd encountered prejudice before, but this felt different, more direct, more personal. Her fingers tightened around the deed, the paper creasing slightly. She wasn't sure if she was angry, hurt, or simply stunned by the audacity of it all. She looked back at the guards, who remained silent, their faces impassive. She had come to this place for peace, to escape the demands of her life, and now, even that was being taken from her. How could this woman, someone who probably had no clue what it meant to fight for a space, decide who was welcome and who wasn't? The woman, seeing Ariel's hesitation, took a step forward. "You've made your point," Ariel said, her voice more composed than she felt. "But I'm not going anywhere." The woman leaned in, her smile turning smug. "You'll find that you don't have much choice in the matter." With a final glance at the security guards, she turned and walked away, the sound of her heels striking the ground like a final nail in the coffin. Ariel's hands clenched into fists. She could feel her pulse in her temples, her body vibrating with frustration and anger. Her mind raced, but one thought kept circling back. This wasn't just about a beach. This was about power. This was about control. And it was about who got to decide where she belonged. The quiet afternoon she had been anticipating was gone in an instant. Instead of walking barefoot along the water, breathing in the salty air and finding solace in the rhythm of the waves, Ariel was left standing at the edge of the beach, a stranger in a place she had once thought was her sanctuary. Her mind replayed the moment again and again. How quickly everything had shifted, how one woman's decision had unraveled the calm she had come to cherish. Ariel's heart beat wildly in her chest, but as she looked around, she realized that the peace she had once found here had been stolen from her. It wasn't just the disruption of her afternoon. It was a deeper invasion into the space she had created for herself. The guards didn't see her as an owner of this place, nor did they seem to care that her name was on the deed. They saw her only as an intruder. The realization settled heavily in her chest. This wasn't just an unfortunate event. This was a message. Her status, her place in this world, none of it was as secure as she had once believed. What was she going to do now? How could she confront this? Ariel didn't know, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let this moment define her. She had a plan, and she would find a way to make her presence known. She would reclaim her space. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The incident at the beach was only the beginning. Ariel's thoughts remained clouded for the rest of the day as she tried to return to her normal routine, but the feeling of being rejected from a place that was rightfully hers gnawed at her. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of that woman, blonde, self-assured, dismissive, flashed before her. She replayed the interaction over and over, her mind cycling between anger and confusion. How could she do that? By the end of the week, the situation had only worsened. Ariel's attempts to return to the beach were thwarted at every turn. The guards were more aggressive, blocking her path with even greater certainty. She would approach the entrance, only to be told again that she wasn't allowed. They seemed to have become emboldened, no longer giving her the courtesy of discussing the matter. The guards simply refused her entry, citing the supposed club membership with a casual finality that infuriated her. It wasn't just the beach. She began to feel the repercussions of the incident ripple out into her work life. Word had spread about the confrontation, and with it, whispers followed. She was now the black woman who was kicked off the private beach. People, her clients, even her colleagues, talked behind her back, exchanging knowing glances whenever her name came up. Was she too aggressive? Too sensitive? Too willing to fight back against things that didn't align with the world they knew? Ariel found herself at the center of the gossip storm at her firm. The private beach incident had become a topic of interest in her circles, and it made her feel like a spectacle rather than a professional. A colleague who had once been warm and welcoming now gave her cold nods and avoided eye contact. At first, Ariel didn't understand why, but it became clear. No one wanted to be associated with someone who had caused a scene. It was all too much. The constant rejection from the guards, the subtle disdain from her colleagues. It was pushing Ariel to the edge. But she couldn't give up. She had worked too hard to let something like this break her. And yet, the toll it was taking on her was undeniable. Her focus at work was slipping, and each day felt like a battle to keep her composure. The first person Ariel confided in was her best friend, Lana. Lana was one of the few people who truly understood her, someone who had been with her through the highs and lows of her career. They'd met during college, and Lana had always been the one to ground Ariel when the world around her seemed chaotic. When Ariel explained the situation, Lana's response was immediate. "This is insane, Ariel. You need to fight back. You have the power, the resources. This isn't just some little misunderstanding. They're trying to erase you from a space you rightfully own. You've got to go to the press, make this public." But Ariel wasn't so sure. "What good would that do?" she replied, her voice tight. "The whole thing feels futile. I'll just be the angry black woman making a scene, and I'll lose credibility. This whole situation is bigger than I thought." Lana's expression softened, her eyes filled with concern. "No, it's not bigger than you. They're just using that as an excuse. You have a legal right to be there. You have the deed. You're not the one at fault here. Despite her best friend's encouragement, Ariel wasn't convinced. Lana's confidence, however, gave her a glimmer of hope. Maybe there was more she could do, more avenues she hadn't considered yet. Another secondary character, Charles, a real estate lawyer and Ariel's mentor, entered the scene. He had always been a source of guidance, someone who had helped her navigate the business world. But now he seemed distant. When she brought up the beach issue, he listened but didn't offer the same encouragement Lana had. "I'm sorry you're dealing with this, Ariel, but I'm not sure what else you can do," Charles said, leaning back in his chair. "It's a private property dispute, and while you have the deed, there are all sorts of legal loopholes these clubs use. They have the power, and that's the reality. You might want to just let it go for now." "Let it go?" Ariel repeated, her frustration boiling over. "This is my property. I'm not just going to let it go." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Sometimes the fight isn't worth it, Ariel. You know that." His words stung. The idea of just letting this injustice slide grating against her very being. But it was clear that Charles, like so many others, didn't fully understand. He was a part of that world, the world where power and wealth determined who got to exist in spaces like this. The people who controlled the club would always win, no matter how right she was. As the days wore on, Ariel's mind was caught in a spiral. It was clear that Charles was advising her to back off, but Lana's words kept echoing in her ears. She felt torn between two realities: the comfortable life she had built by following the rules and the sudden, urgent desire to fight for something that mattered. The situation at the beach had begun to seep into every corner of Ariel's life. At night, as she lay awake, her mind replayed the events of the past week in painful detail. She had come to realize that this wasn't just about a beach. It was about everything she had ever fought for. Her career, her place in society, her right to claim space and not be diminished. This incident had made her question everything. She was constantly grappling with the fear that, as much as she fought, she would never be able to break through the barriers that society had placed in front of her. The beach was symbolic of something bigger, something more insidious. The way her successes had always been scrutinized, the way she was constantly expected to prove that she belonged. But no matter what she did, it felt like she was always being pushed to the margins, always reminded that her place in the world was conditional. What if fighting back only made things worse? What if she alienated everyone she had worked so hard to build relationships with? Her thoughts were a chaotic mix of fear and frustration. She had always been the one to rise above adversity, to remain composed in the face of challenges, but this situation felt different. It wasn't just about power dynamics in the real estate world anymore. This was about her identity, her right to exist as a full person in spaces where she had earned her place. But there was something in her that refused to back down. Deep inside, a spark of defiance began to grow. She couldn't just let this happen. She couldn't be made to feel small, to be driven out of a space she had a legal right to occupy. She wouldn't allow herself to be the invisible woman anymore. She would take back what was hers, even if it meant challenging the very systems that had tried to suppress her. The fear still lingered, but so did the conviction that she had a responsibility, not just to herself, but to everyone who had ever been marginalized, to stand up and fight for what was right. This wasn't just about a beach. This was about her standing up for her space in a world that wanted to shrink her. As the days passed, Ariel could feel the storm building inside her. The situation was escalating, and she could feel it in every moment. The subtle sneers from her colleagues, the growing tension with the guards, the sense that everyone was watching, waiting to see how far she would go. She knew now that her fight was no longer about just a place on a beach. It was about her right to belong. And soon, it would be time to make her move. The questions swirling in her mind were no longer about if, but when. When would she take the first step? And when she did, she knew it would change everything. It had been a month since the incident on the beach, and Ariel had spent every day fighting against the internal battle that consumed her. The legal avenues she had explored felt like slow, frustrating processes, nothing concrete, no resolution. The whispers continued, the social isolation deepened, and she felt like she was drowning in a world that seemed determined to remind her that she didn't belong. But one evening, after another rejection from the beach guards, Something inside Ariel snapped. It wasn't just the injustice anymore. It was everything she had been holding back, all the years of proving herself, of fighting against the stereotypes and expectations placed upon her. She stood at the edge of the beach once more, the sand beneath her feet warm from the fading sun. She held the deed to the property in her hand, her fingers tightly gripping it as if it was the only thing tethering her to reality. For a moment, she simply stood there, staring at the ocean, her heart heavy with the weight of everything she had experienced. The beach was silent, except for the crashing of waves and the distant call of seagulls. It felt like a final moment of calm before a storm. The same security guard from the first confrontation approached, his face unreadable. Ariel squared her shoulders, determined to confront this head-on, to push back in a way she hadn't before. "I've had enough," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I own this property. I will not be forced off again." The guard didn't respond, but his stance told her everything. The way he looked at her, almost with pity, felt like a slap across her face. It wasn't just that they didn't care about the deed she held. It was that they never saw her as someone who deserved to be there in the first place. Ariel took a deep breath and stepped forward, her steps quick and purposeful. "I'm done with this. I'm going to show you exactly who I am." At that moment, as the guards watched her approach with a mix of annoyance and disbelief, Ariel felt a wave of determination rush through her. She was no longer the passive woman trying to navigate a world that constantly told her she wasn't enough. She was going to take control. Just as Ariel was about to confront the guards, a figure emerged from the shadows of the nearby cliffs. The tall, blonde woman, the same one who had dismissed her weeks ago, stepped into view, her lips curled in that same smug smile. But this time, something was different. She was holding something in her hands, something that made Ariel's heart race. "Still here," the woman said, her voice dripping with arrogance. "You're truly relentless, aren't you?" Ariel didn't answer. She didn't have to. Instead, she raised the deed high, her fingers trembling, but not from fear. The deed was her claim, her right to this land, and she wasn't backing down. But as she did, the woman's eyes flickered to something behind her. The woman's gaze was cold. "You think you have rights here, don't you?" she said, her tone laced with amusement. But the twist came next. As the woman stepped closer, a small, inconspicuous folder in her hand caught Ariel's eye. She opened it, revealing documents that immediately made Ariel's breath catch in her throat. The woman, smiling triumphantly, held up a different deed. It was dated more recently than Ariel's. The document, Ariel realized with growing horror, was for the same beach, her beach. "I'm the rightful owner of this land now," the woman said with a smugness that made Ariel's blood boil. "And now, you're the one who doesn't belong here." The weight of what the woman had just revealed hit Ariel like a slap to the face. The deed she'd held, the very paper that had once given her a sense of security, no longer mattered. It was useless against this new revelation. Ariel's mind reeled with the implications. Had her ownership been fraudulent all along? Had she missed something in the fine print? Or was it just a matter of a deeper, systemic injustice playing out? The world around her blurred for a moment as she tried to make sense of the betrayal. She had always trusted that her rights were secure, that she belonged in this space. But now, it seemed as though she was fighting not just against a single person, but against the entire system that had been working against her all along. Ariel's heart felt heavy in her chest as she stood there, staring at the woman, her mind scrambling to find any shred of comfort. She had believed, so deeply, in the idea that the system would work in her favor, that if she fought hard enough, if she held on tightly to the things she had earned, she could weather any storm. But this felt like the storm had already arrived, and it was bigger than anything she had ever imagined. The deed that had once symbolized her power now felt like a cruel joke. All of the work she had put into carving out a space for herself in the world, all the moments when she had fought against systemic racism and prejudice, everything had led to this moment. She had thought that owning this property, claiming this piece of the world, would be a symbol of her success, her belonging. But now, in the face of this new deed, she felt small. She felt invisible. Tears threatened to rise in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming feeling of injustice that had once again taken root in her life. She had always fought to prove her worth, to justify her place in spaces that weren't made for people like her. And now, in this one moment, it felt as though everything she had worked for had been swept away. But then something inside her shifted. The anger that had been building for weeks surged up once more, fiercer than before. This wasn't just about the land. This was about her right to exist in the spaces she had earned, her right to stand tall and claim her place in a world that constantly tried to push her out. The twist wasn't the deed. The twist was realizing that she could no longer rely on the system to define her worth. Ariel didn't need that deed to be the woman she was. She didn't need the beach to prove that she belonged. She belonged by her own terms, by the work she had done, by the battles she had fought, by the truth of who she was. The beach had been a symbol of that fight, but it didn't define her. She would define herself, whether the world recognized her or not. With newfound clarity, Ariel lifted her chin and turned to face the woman. "You might have that deed," she said, her voice steady, "but you'll never have the right to erase me." The woman faltered, her confidence faltering for a brief moment. Ariel didn't need the beach to win this battle. She had already won. After the confrontation on the beach, Ariel didn't rush into action. She needed time to process the events, to let everything settle into a place where she could see clearly. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel all the emotions she had been pushing aside: anger, fear, shame, and ultimately, acceptance. The realization that her worth wasn't tied to any one space, any one fight, allowed Ariel to begin the healing process. She reached out to the people who mattered most, starting with Lana. Their conversation was long, a cathartic exchange of ideas, frustrations, and hopes. Lana, ever the supportive friend, reminded Ariel that her worth was not only about battling for a piece of land. It was about everything she had accomplished, the way she had shown up, time and again, in a world that wasn't always ready to embrace her. Ariel also reached out to Charles, the mentor who had once told her to let the beach incident go. She had been angry at his dismissiveness, but now she understood the burden he carried, the way his own privileges clouded his perspective. She didn't want to stay angry, so she extended an olive branch, acknowledging the complexity of the situation. Their conversation was an eye-opener for both, and though they didn't always see eye to eye, Ariel realized that sometimes healing involved meeting people halfway, especially when they had been a part of her journey. One of the most important steps Ariel took was not external, it was internal. She started to forgive herself. For too long, she had held herself to impossible standards, trying to be everything to everyone. Now, she let go of the need to constantly prove herself. She embraced her flaws and her strengths, understanding that her value wasn't measured by others' expectations, but by her own beliefs. Ariel's outlook on life began to shift. The fight for the beach, while an important catalyst, was no longer the central focus. She had taken her power back in ways that couldn't be measured by deeds or property titles. She was learning that real transformation didn't come from changing the world around her. It came from changing her relationship with herself. Her behavior reflected this change. She began to speak up in meetings at work, not with the desperation to prove herself that she had once felt, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew her worth. She no longer sought validation from others, but instead trusted her own instincts. Her colleagues noticed the shift, and while not everyone was on board with the changes, the respect she had earned over the years became undeniable. Even her relationships deepened. She began to connect with people on a more genuine level, no longer hiding behind the walls of perfectionism. She embraced the vulnerability that came with being authentic, and in turn, her connections became richer. Lana was there for her, but now their friendship felt more like a partnership as they both grew and supported each other in new ways. Her self-confidence became contagious, and people around her began to see her differently, not as someone who was constantly fighting to belong, but as someone who had already arrived, who had always been deserving. As Ariel stood once more at the edge of the beach, her thoughts were no longer filled with frustration or regret. The ocean stretched before her, vast and endless, and she realized that it mirrored her own journey. There would always be challenges, moments when the world seemed to push her out, but she had learned something invaluable. Her place in the world was not given by others. It was hers to claim, hers to define. The beach, once a symbol of rejection, now stood as a symbol of growth. Ariel had faced the limits of her past, and she had broken free from them. She no longer needed the validation of others to know who she was or what she deserved. She was ready for whatever came next, knowing that her strength wasn't found in what she owned or in external recognition, but in the unshakable belief that she was worthy no matter what. In a quiet moment, Ariel returned to the sand, her bare feet sinking into the warmth beneath her. She no longer clutched the deed to the property. There was no need. Instead, she simply stood, taking in the vastness of the ocean before her. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the waves, and for the first time in a long while, Ariel felt at peace. She wasn't defined by the fight anymore. She wasn't defined by the past or by the limitations others had tried to impose on her. She was simply herself, strong, resilient, and unapologetically present in her own life. The world had tried to shrink her, but she had grown beyond it. And now, as the waves lapped gently at her feet, she understood that this was only the beginning. If you were moved by Ariel's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful tales of resilience and transformation. Join us as we explore journeys of self-discovery and the courage it takes to embrace change. Stay tuned for more inspiring content.